All right, today we talk about democratization. So let me preface this by saying that democratization is not really an area of expertise for me. So the information that I'm going to present to you is fairly basic and consistent with a general consensus within the discipline. I'll try to point out some major areas of disagreements, but I don't claim to be able to give you elements to help you decide between these different views. The first view to consider is modernization theory. Modernization theory seeks to answer two main questions. Why do countries become democracies, and why do countries remain democracies once they have transitioned? Now, these questions essentially get the same answer. As average incomes rise, demand for all goods rises, and that includes a demand for democracy. So in other words, at lower levels of income, people want democracy, but they're too poor to be able to quote-unquote buy it. But demand is not enough to secure a supply of democracy in the face of dictators with guns and power. So what is the mechanism by which rising income spurs democratization? Several theories are on the table. The earliest theories talk about what's necessary to run an economy once you get a certain degree of complexity in production. So for example, you need education and a qualified workforce, but as people get more educated, they tend to want more of a say in things. They tend to become more capable of getting those things. Another theory is that when people have more substantial incomes, they have something to bargain with. So when they're poor, they have nothing the state really wants, but once they get a little bit richer, the state now wants some of their money in the form of income taxes, and in order to get those income taxes, the state sometimes has to give those people what they want. Adam Jaworski thinks that democracies are economically more stable than dictatorships. His theory is that a dictatorship is kind of a gamble. But if you're poor, you have little to lose, so you're willing to cooperate with dictators who promise you the moon, so to speak. When you get a little income, you want to protect what you have, and that means trading the dictator for a system where your income and your wealth ends up being better protected. This idea relies on the fairly well-established notion that democracies tend to grow economically fairly stably, but you don't see democracies with fantastic rates of economic growth, and you tend not to see democracies with catastrophic rates of economic contraction. On the other hand, if you look at dictatorships, you see both the fastest growers in the world are often dictatorships, and then you also see some of the worst economic catastrophes also as dictatorships. But if not modernization theory, then what? Elite theory focuses not on the demand for democracy, but on the incentives for those in power to supply democracy. Elite theorists ask things like, when is it safe to give up power, and when does it make better sense to give up power than to risk staying in power? Now, we often think that it's good to be king, but dictatorship can be very stressful. You have to please powerful actors who might launch a coup to replace you. Your life expectancy is often not that long. You spend your life being paranoid about assassins and would-be usurpers, and you don't always get to enjoy the fruits of your power. As soon as you become a little bit complacent and start enjoying the lifestyle, you suddenly get replaced by someone who is more ambitious and hungry than you are. So sometimes it might actually be rational to give up power in exchange for a secure retirement. And this can happen if the democratic constitution gives you some guarantees, particularly guarantees as to your security and safety and your property rights. Chile's transition to democracy is a good example, where General Augusto Pinochet and his generals were made senators for life after stepping down from power, and thus they became immune from prosecution for whatever crimes that they might have committed while they were members of the junta. Now, Pinochet, who was undoubtedly responsible for many murders, ironically was eventually arrested, but not in Chile, where he committed most of his crimes. He was arrested in London on the orders of a Spanish judge. Isn't globalization great? Now, a different view, associated in its early versions with Alexis de Tocqueville and more recently with political scientist Robert Putnam, focuses on civil society. It's fine and good for people to have incentives and interests, but if there's no organizations capable of mobilizing people in support of political goals and training them in the art of democratic governance and compromise, then democracy may never arise, or if it does arise, it won't survive very long. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French aristocrat visiting the United States in the 1820s, looked at America and thought that one of the reasons American democracy succeeded was that civil society associations like Rotary clubs or neighborhood watch associations or even churches taught people important civic skills and provided the United States with a reservoir of leadership as well as support for collaborative ways of governing. You might look at these civil society associations as training grounds for future Democrats. Recent advocates of the power of civil society, like Robert Putnam, note how important associations that cut across social classes, or he calls them cross-cutting associations, are for the health of a democracy. If people get used to bargaining as equals as part of small-scale associations, they become better equipped to handle the political conflicts of a democratic society. It's an almost cultural argument in a way. Norms of behavior are created that contribute to what political scientists sometimes call a civic culture. Now, it hasn't escaped anyone that democratic transitions aren't random in history. They tend to occur in bunches all together at once. For example, the first wave came in the late 18th century, and throughout the 19th century, starting with, of course, the United States, and then France, and then a number of countries in Europe. And the second wave came after World War II, with both decolonization of former colonies within the British and French empires, and the transitions to democracy of the former Axis powers, Germany and Japan and Italy. The third came after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989 to 1991, a whole bunch of former Soviet satellite states, including Russia itself, transitioned to democracy. Now, each of these transitions came with its share of regression afterwards. That is to say, many democracies transitioned, but several went back to dictatorship after a few years. But it's worth noting that each of these also had significant geographic components. That is to say, they weren't random around the Earth. Latin American countries often transitioned within a few years from each other. European countries often transitioned within a few years of each other. African countries, many of them transitioned, although many of them also regressed later. So what we see is geographic concentration as well as cultural diffusion of democracy. And that suggests that it's not just about income, but there's something else going on as well. So this leads us to the idea that cultural and ideological imitation, in a way, play a role in transitions, where if people feel like it's the right thing to do, then they do it. Or if other people like them are doing it, they say, hey, we are like these other folks, shouldn't we also get the democracy that these other folks are getting? Now, this is kind of known as a constructivist argument. For those of you who are scholars of international relations, you might recognize this word, constructivism, which essentially means that people do things that they feel is appropriate. That is to say, they do things because they think it's appropriate to do them. And again, they tend to imitate other people who are doing the same thing as they are. So, in conclusion, it's probably safe to say that there's not one reason why a country transitions to democracy. Often you have a combination of favorable factors, creating a kind of critical juncture where change is suddenly possible where it wasn't before. It's also worth distinguishing questions of why countries in general transition, so why do countries in general transition to democracy, and why this particular country transitioned at this particular time and in this particular place. The more specific you get in your question, the more contingent factors like specific leaders and specific economic circumstances like a crisis play a strong role. So thanks for listening, and if you have questions, you know how to reach me.